My name is Tom Woodcock. I am a teacher of a long time, a trade unionist, a trade union activist, and a political activist, I suppose, and a filmmaker at the moment as well, in film education and work in film education. Anything that resembles a democracy, I think that's quite an easy thing for people to say. It's a little more difficult when you scratch the surface at what people mean by that. I think we hear a lot of people say the system's broken, that we live in a very limited democracy, and so on. But for me, the democracy that we're offered is really beyond limited. It offers very little, if not nothing, to ordinary people. It's an illusion and a pretense, and it cannot be fixed in the shape of electing new people to the parliament that we're offered or any of those sorts of things. So democracy for me is the ability for myself, my work friends and colleagues, the rest of society, and the mass of people to be able to participate fully in the decisions that involve our life. And that means the time that we have to spend, our productive labor, where we do those things, where we do our leisure activities, and all of those things in the current society and what is presented to us as, I suppose, a bourgeois democracy are regulated by other people, and other people that are almost always out of our control, unaccountable, and completely beyond our selection. They don't get voted in. They make decisions completely apart from the democratic system that we're offered. I think that the sort of statistics, the numbers that are thrown around that make people realize what an unequal society we live in, it demonstrates some of those things. So in Britain, 50% or more of the land in Britain is owned by 1% of the population. In the world, 50 people have the same amount of wealth as half the world's population. These people are not in the control of any democratic force whatsoever. I think when you look at climate change, for example, which is a classic one about blaming ordinary people for the ills of the climate, it's 100 companies that have contributed more than 75% of all carbon emissions in the entirety of history. None of these companies are run democratically or are subject to elections or anything else. So it's an utter illusion. It's scratching the surface of anything that resembles democracy that we have. Working people, sometimes, in Marxist terms, I suppose we talk about working class people. Sometimes people think that doesn't exist anymore or whatever, but I think we have to remind people that's the majority of the planet now. That's by far the vast majority of people in Britain, people who have to sell our labour and time to other people. We people who have to do that do have a strong tradition of carving out and building democratic organizations ourselves, and they're thrown up in the most wonderful forms, often in workplaces where we're exploited through trade unions and through combines and more rank and file trade union activity that's sort of more independent of the official trade unions and so on, as people are forced to try and fight for just to defend a little bit of time for ourselves, to stop us being, ultimately, exploited by working more hours or by working for less pay. So my experience of democratic sort of contribution has largely been around those sorts of organisations, away from what people might think of like the traditional forms of democracy, where we vote once every 4 or 5 years for somebody, and I can't remember who the quote's from, that you vote to hand and give your democracy away. So where we can be more democratic is where we get choices about fighting back in those forms, and of course in the movement around huge movements around against the wars that our governments commit in our name. We're massively involved in fighting against the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the continuation of fighting against that war particularly has built a movement that understands the position around Palestine in the world, and particularly the British government's involvement in that conflict over decades and decades and decades. And I think in Britain, one of the brilliant things that the anti-war movement did in the early part of this century was to be absolutely ruthless about pinning the plight of Palestinian people to the conquests of the British and American and European governments in the Middle East around Iraq and Afghanistan, which puts the mass movement around Palestine in a very healthy position. And, building those movements from the street through, and in workplaces and so on, I think it's been where I'd say the contribution is that we can make. But also in trying to fight against those who want to limit even further the small amount of democracy that we do get, as people's living standards and wages and so on are under attack or perceived to be under attack. Then some people are more inclined to try and seek solutions around strong leaders or right-wing figures who offer some form of order and so forth, and usually they do that to scapegoat people through racism and so on. So we're in a very dangerous situation around the rise of racism, blaming immigrants and blaming refugees and migrants. And personally, I take quite a role in trying to build people to actively, counter those forces organising, of which I see as one of the major threats to our us being able to participate in democracy, either the democracy that we're offered by the state and from above, or the democracy that we're able to build from below through our own organisations and so on. And that's I think what I think we should be contributing, and that's what I try to contribute towards a healthy democracy. It's hard to talk, not speaking more generally, but I think my personal experience is probably quite similar to many people, which is that you pick up and get involved in democratic activities through traditions that are taught to you by others, particularly. Sometimes, for me, both my parents were actively involved in a mass movement around the campaign for nuclear disarmament, which was a hugely important movement throughout the post-war period in Britain, and had various resurgences. And during the 80s, when things were quite bleak for those who had been suffered some industrial defeats during the 70s and the early 80s, but this campaign for nuclear disarmament was quite a large organisation and gave me a flavour of the fact that political engagement was not something that was just done at the ballot box. So I think that's a hugely important early set of experiences. But I think, young people, other people around me who were in revolutionary organisations in my teens, that the experience of the anti-racist struggle against the British National Party in my teens was probably the most important thing in transforming my political outlook and engagement. So I was at Welling when the police attacked a massive anti-racist demonstration, which was trying to close down the British National Party's bookshop, which was very close to where Stephen Lawrence was killed. And one of the contributing factors, I think, to the BNP members who were involved in killing him, wasn't an isolated incident. It was an attack by organised fascists on which is what we see when racists organise, is that racist killings go up and so on. My understanding of the British state, of the role of the police in society, on whose side they're on, and how the British media is prepared to present ordinary people when they try and get involved in their democratic right, and how they present us as violent instigators of anti-democratic forces. That's just exactly how that protest was presented. I mean, I was injured quite seriously on that demonstration, along with many other people. And as a 16-year-old, that changes your view on your trust of the forces. I don't have any illusion that these people are working for anybody other than the people who have the money and the land and so on. So those things are very formative, I think. How you actually then shape your sort of adult political life, I think, is really around, particularly when I arrived in a workplace. As a young teacher, I was entering a school system that I didn't like, that I had a horrible experience of as a young person, and that I was determined that I might be able to change it as a teacher, and to realize quite quickly that what you could teach, how you could teach it, when you taught, the number of people in the classroom, how useless the buildings were, how ill-resourced you were. These things, mean your individual ideas are unable to shift the big machine and the injustice that, and what our education system and so on is for, which is for turning out, stratas of classes to do menial jobs, and some people who are lucky enough to be able to engage in other work. And if you're going to get an education beyond the basics, it's to be educated in the things that industry needs, not the things that artists and creatives and actually, even on a productive level, people in terms of our food and clothes and everything else really need. When you realize that, your best bet is to try and work with other people to change it. And that, I think that's what shaped my experience of building democratic organizations, is trying to work to change institutions through collective working action. And it's, I have to say, been a long and pretty demoralizing experience, because education and other things have gone backwards over the last 25, 30 years in quite a horrendous way. And we've been fighting a rearguard action that's been victorious only in stopping it getting worse quicker. But I dread to think what education and other institutions in society would look like if there wasn't. I'm by no means the only one working to try and do this. There are hundreds of thousands of teacher trade unions, and tens of thousands of active people who are, putting their heels in and putting the brakes on them being able to take us further and faster down, a horrible road. There are two fault lines, I would probably say. One is the defense of what we already have, which is very limited, but the pretense of it is an important factor. I don't underestimate this. I think it's extraordinarily important to take voting seriously, to stand in the elections that they give us, even though I understand that largely it's a propaganda exercise, and that what's holding our side together and what's stopping them from making life even worse for us is the bits of democracy we build elsewhere. But I do think it's really worth defending, and I think that's that's a key thing. But in defending it, I think it exposes the other fault line, which is that millions, hundreds of thousands of people have just signed up for a new political party, which hasn't even come into existence yet. But the excitement and need for it is huge, and it shows just what a gulf there is on the progressive left of British politics. That's really important. But my suspicion is that many people in the organisation, or wanting to join that organisation, have huge illusions in the ability for councillors and parliamentary politicians to change things just by implementing different ideas. And the fault line for me will become quite sharp, I think, around how we can build and win the reality, which is that the only things that we're going to be able to win as ordinary working people is things that we fight for outside of Parliament, and that the new organisation that is emerging needs to take elections very, very seriously, but needs to be able to pivot extremely firmly towards building the mass movements on the street and building trade union or working class activity. And the trade union leaders are not our friends, but the trade union members are. And we have to build beyond and above the heads of the trade union leaders, who are extraordinarily conservative in Britain, and build our own organisations that can start to shape a society that's very, very different. For the last 400 or 500 years, since the move from feudalism to capitalism, when people had a bit of land or were given a bit to work and had some control over what they grew and what they did with their time, and as we've been shunted off the land and into factories and workplaces and now call centres and delivery drivers and whatnot else, the shift, ever since that shift, there has been a fight for winning the vote, for winning some level of democracy in the set shape that we have it. But I am under no illusion that under capitalism, which is the economic system that we have in place at the moment, there is an absolute contradiction to have democracy under capitalism. Capitalism relies on people who have capital, that is the means of production, so the land, the tools, the raw materials, the machinery, and so on. And as I said at the beginning, that is in the hands of not just a percentage of people. You can actually count the number of people that really significantly own those things. It is individuals, not groups of people, who are not democratically accountable. And even if you reform that in any way, which I think, given the internal contradictions and how unstable that system of the economy is, it's not reformable. And therefore, a healthy democracy is one in which we build and we hold to account those people by starving them of their power, which means taking all of those things off them. And that is not going to be voted for in Parliament. It's going to be won on the street, and through most importantly, through refusing to work for these people. And that's an entirely different type of democratic approach. And that's what a healthy democracy will look like, where the hundreds of thousands, the millions of people in the world, through their own democratic forces, will stop the control of a very few people. So the opposite way round to what's happening at the moment, which is that at the moment, the 1% tell the rest of us what to do. So that's my view of what a healthy democracy, and I don't think it's a dream. I think it's a necessity. Those people who think we're idealists, well, idealists think ideas change the world. I think real action changes the world, and I think we have the power to build it. I have faith in ordinary people to do that, and I can't wait to watch it happen.